Hi, my name is Raisa Britannia, and I'm a fashion historian and an adjunct instructor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where I teach courses in 20th century fashion and art, as well as the history of costume and fashion in film. So today I have the pleasure of being here with the costume designer and the production designer of the new Netflix series Halston, starring Ewan McGregor. And this is a 5-episode series that chronicles the life and career of the iconic American designer, which naturally includes some very spectacular fashion. So I'm happy to host this collaboration between Netflix and the Fashion Institute of Technology, which is home to the Halston Archive, which includes over 50,000 fashion items and accessories. Also housed within the museum at FIT Collection are archived designs, patterns, and related records that document this important designer's life's work. And in addition to that, the Special Collections Division at the FIT Library is home to hundreds of Halston sketches and photographs. So as you can see, FIT is rich in resources when it comes to documenting Halston's legacy, and we're thrilled to see it continued through this new series on Netflix. So let's begin by letting our panelists introduce themselves and perhaps also telling us how they came to this project. Let's start with Jeriana.
Well, hello. So I came to Halston through our line producer who I'd worked with previously. I'm actually a graduate of FIT and thought I was going to be a fashion designer when I grew up, and then changed course as I was at FIT actually, and started to lean into theatrical design. I started the theater ensemble there when I was there, which I think is it's still active today, and started designing all of the plays that we put on.
Fabulous. And so, Mark.
Well, I was, as is typical, I was given the script. The project was mentioned to me. I had just finished designing Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, so it was attractive to me because it was just like, couldn't get any further away from that material to just do something completely different. And all you had to do was take a couple of looks at imagery from Halston's life, as I did. I mean, I had a vague memory. I mean, as a child of the 70s, for me, it was more about J.C. Penney than Studio 54 at that point. But, it was a project that you just could not say no to. It's well written. I mean, the sets were just, it was great. I'd never done anything like it. And so I wanted to jump off that cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Exciting. So this next question is for both of you. In creating the show, what was the research process like, and what type of sources did you consult?
Mark. Well, I think Mark and I worked together really in our research, because there is so much about Halston that is, and his aesthetic and his design sensibility that extends beyond clothes. I think his eye reaches up to everything from makeup to interiors. So it really felt about, I think for both of us, about kind of exploring his creativity and what his brand meant. And also just in terms of the way that he used the interiors, I think, and the clothes, they always related to one another. Whether they were, meant to be almost one and the same, or whether they were meant to contrast. So we shared our research, I think, from the very beginning. Whatever book you didn't have, I had. Whatever book I didn't have, you had, and we really shared everything we could get a hold of. I know in particular, I really leaned on resources like the Condé Nast archive at Vogue, and really dug there for every earliest mention of Halston, and also Elsa Peretti and Joe Eula. And the same thing at Women's Wear Daily, and looking through like old microfiche, like real investigative reporting, finding everything I could, really. And also all of the people who we spoke to firsthand, which Mark, maybe you can speak to, all of those great conversations we had with people who knew him.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say ditto to everything. I mean, it's just like there's a wealth of imagery out there. I mean, I went straight to the environments. I mean, Olympic Tower, the Paul Rudolph House, um, the Battle of Versailles. We didn't have the scripts yet, as is typical with television. We don't have everything on day one, but I knew about the battle, so I assumed it was coming. Um, Generally, just New York City and the period. I like to go to the New York City Picture Collection at the public library and just find all of the images that are there. Start specific and then broaden out, even though we had really specific things to look at here. I mean, what fascinated me was that process of discovering what we represent in episode 1, which is the sort of, the less before he reached the level of fame. I mean, there was certainly photography going around, but it wasn't as much as we had later. So through a circumstance, I ended up, the very first person I talked to was Sherry Peregrine, who had worked, I think she ran Halston's made to order division up at, she never went to Olympic Tower, but she was there in the early days. So she was a wealth of information. And Chris Royer, of course, who was, fantastic for us, one of the original Halstonettes, literally did ground plans. I mean, she did architectural renderings of Olympic Tower and the boutique on 68th Street. So it's just like a lot of conversation to just absorb specifics, but also just the essence of what, the detail from the green candles, just details like that you wouldn't necessarily know from looking at photographs.
Yeah.
Just cobble it all together.
Dan was also really great at kind of bringing, I think, our voices together in the early phase. Our director, Dan Minahan, really, gave us everything from, even a playlist to listen to sort of get in the groove and get inspired by, what music was happening and he was surrounding himself with. So I think that was really, it was so much fun to, I think, get on the same creative page.
His own pile of interview magazines, ended up on the set. I mean, it's just, yeah, we were all cross-referencing everything we could get our hands on.
So let me actually pull up the presentation. But while I'm doing that, my next question for you is, as both of you have said, Halston's life and work are very, very well documented. All of these events very well documented. And so as designers, was your goal to accurately recreate these environments and these clothes, or were you aiming to capture the essence of it? So where were you aiming as far as exact historical accuracy?
Jeriana?
Well, I think Mark and I kind of made a pact early on in our approaching this story, that we were, I think, for at least I can speak to my own experience personally, I really wanted to do this story authentically and correctly, and I wanted to honor his legacy and his work and do it right. I really did, and I hope I did so. So I really studied it, inside and out, took dresses and folded them inside out and looked at the construction and the patterns and the fabrics and all. But then there is a moment where you sort of have to really know the textbook, where you can sort of recite it and know it so well, and then you put it away and you go back to the story that you're telling and how you can do that and really just create a beautiful story, from what's on the page. And then it was really about editing. For me, it was about editing and finding sort of quintessential colors or silhouettes, really trying to pay my respects design wise, but also I really had to sort of put on my Halston design hat quite often and use my imagination, sort of design, in the voice of, quite often, even for other designers as well, like Bill Blass or Oscar de la Renta, or, you name it. So it really was a matter of getting it all, understanding it all so well that I could sort of complete a sentence. And quite often I sort of say we were turning, novels of his work into little poems. So sometimes it was just about, capturing the spirit of something and, in a quick moment.
I remember there were moments, when we were trying to figure out the battle and whatnot, and Jeriana was desperate to find out, how we were actually going to film things because, the resources are not unlimited as much as you would love for them to be, and just being able to pick and choose, as she was saying, the right moment of the right poem within the novel. I mean, for me with the sets, I remember in the very first conversation that I had with Dan once I was on the job, the notion of how realistic did we want to be just in terms of recreating the sets, or was there an element that we would push the envelope just to blow it up even more, and just from a stylistic storytelling point of view, and we really landed on, we just kept looking at the photographs, and Halston's world was so, large anyway, that we didn't need to. I mean, this like he lived in the fantasy, so recreating Olympic Tower was already just creating Oz in the sky, and the townhouse, the Paul Rudolph townhouse. I mean, everything was so fantastic that we really used that as our guiding light in terms of getting there. I mean, one thing that I also tried to do just in the sets was to ground it in a reality. Even as fantastic as these places were, he was a man who lived a life, and everybody was a human being. And in the workrooms, we wanted them to feel like workrooms. If there was a kitchen, if things were just happening, we wanted it to feel like real life, to see the real life that's behind the imagery. That's what we do with storytelling, and so it's just a combination of all of that, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
That's an important point, I think, too, that we always tried to keep that note in mind about the fact that it was such an elevated and sort of aspirational fantasy fashion world, that in order to be able to relate to these characters and their journeys on screen and really feel their emotional journey with some depth, it was a matter of kind of breaking that sort of pristine surface once in a while. I think even for the clothes, that they might look a little lived in and worn, even though the dress might be fabulous. I didn't necessarily want it to always look like a photo shoot.
Exactly. The same thing with, I mean, there's one thing to show the townhouse and every photograph of it, unless there was a party going on. I mean, it's photographed for perfection, but we have scenes where a man is just living in his house, and what happens with the silverware after it's eaten, or what just gets thrown around. I mean, it's still Halston, so there wasn't much, but we tried to just figure out what those moments were, how a place would transition, and that alike.
Mm-hmm.
So, going a bit off script, but while you're talking about this, creating these real people, these real lived in spaces, I did read a few interviews, Jeriana, about the work you did with Ewan in teaching him how to move like a designer. I'm just interested in hearing about kind of that method acting that came into play.
Yeah, I mean, my work with Ewan, started as soon as I was able to connect with him, and he started sharing with me images. I started sharing with him images, footage that I was able to get a hold of. I shared with him, and vice versa. And really, it really was about discovering him very holistically as a living, breathing, real person, and not just sort of the glamorous facade. And that was important, I think, for the obvious reasons of really creating a full person, so that we got a sense to look beyond just the sort of fancy exterior. So I did create a crazy wall in my office that was every photo I could find of Halston from the very earliest part of his life that was documented until the very end. And I followed his whole journey, and then I sort of took that and found a way to sort of boil that language down in terms of color and silhouette, and find this journey of his wearing all black in the early stages of his design career, little flavorful accents of that little conch 70s belt, and these ways that he was sort of breaking, that was him breaking 70s style. I mean, he was doing that in the late 60s. So he was sort of, if you think about it, he was really always ahead of his time, and sort of moving into this, cream double face wool coat and all of these white clothes through as we introduce, cocaine and all of the white elements that come with that. Also, it just felt so, glossy, and, introduction of that late 70s and early into the early 80s, all that white. And then we kind of move into a red palette with him. And that was sort of a decision I had sort of made early on, knowing that we were going to move into the Olympic Tower and wanting that red to coincide with the Olympic Tower, which also coincided with a lot of the sort of tumultuous relationships and aggravation and this sort of what becomes the precipice of his fall, and that sort of it all lent itself to the story, and Ewan loved that idea of moving through that color palette and breaking up also, I think, what people think of as just the black turtleneck and black trousers. There's much more texture to it. Even the fact that he wore an ultra suede kind of work jacket when he was doing ultra suede, there was always a sort of a subtle nod to what he was working with in his own clothes. He really was always a brand. So he was always thinking in terms of, if I'm selling ultra suede, I'm wearing ultra suede. And yeah, we worked together on far more than just the clothes. We worked together on just his body language, and he had done tremendous amounts of research on Halston and really had an understanding of all of the little nuances of holding the cigarette and his hand gestures. And one sort of funny story was when that first fitting, when he was sort of rehearsing in the room and trying to find those hand gestures, I had him try on his trousers, the trousers I'd made for him as Halston, and they don't have any pockets in them because Halston's pants legitimately did not have pockets in them. They were made like a 1940s sailor pant, sort of without a side seam. And he was sort of like, it was this like light bulb moment of him realizing that the reason why his hands were always up in the air was because he never had a pocket in his pants to hide them in. And so yeah, we worked together consistently through the whole thing. It was a real joy. I mean, I think we were very lucky that Ewan McGregor was our Halston, because he was we had to work with him so intimately and in this particular, character that was equal parts design and person. And he has a lot of natural style. Ewan himself is a very stylish person. He understands style, and was really just like a really great collaborator.
Excellent. So I would love to get into some specific scenes. I was very lucky to have seen the series, and my gosh, what a delight for the senses it all was. And so I want to talk first about the tie-dye collection from the first episode. So I would like to ask Jeriana how you went about sourcing the garments for this scene.
Well, these clothes are not in stores. Let's start there. Yeah, these pieces are in the Met, the Costume Institute. They're very hard to come by. I did find a few vintage curators and collectors who had some pieces that were very lovely in loaning them to me. I think in total we had, in the original tie-dye fashion show, we had one piece that was loan piece from a vintage collector, and then one piece which actually you can see in your image here. It's the piece that's just the arm coming in from the left-hand side of the picture. That piece is an archival real Halston piece that Roy Halston Froick designed that I was able to find from a designer vintage collector. And we used it, of course, and I actually used it as the centerpiece for the palette that we built this whole collection around. And then the rest was invented. I mean, there was a caftan we had to create on camera that we needed, for all practical filming purposes, we needed it as a fabric. We needed multiples of it in order to cut on camera. We needed it built into a dress on camera, so pinned into a garment live in action on camera, and then also presented as a fully realized dress on the runway. So that was a creation, and there were others as well, marrying concepts from his original work, documented pieces, like, for example, this pajama on the African American model right there. And that pajama is a documented piece, and I found an image of it at the Condé Nast Libraries. However, it was done in pinks and yellows, and I really wanted to bring this whole collection into more of the green-blue color palette in order to contrast Mark's wonderful backdrop. So that's a great example, I think, in terms of our working together. What better way to start where we both were sort of really approaching real life things that were wildly printed, and finding ourselves sort of needing to find some, artistic license balance between us because of, that amazing interior.
Yes, I have to say what truly made that scene spectacular was this lush setting within the salon. So Mark, can you talk a bit more about your concept for the scene and perhaps a bit about the collaborative design process?
Well, again, we had photographs of what that salon looked like at that point. I mean, my understanding was that, and as we demonstrate in the episode, that Halston had a vision for what his salon would be, but he wasn't quite there yet in his career, and the money wasn't flowing. So he asked his friend Angela Dongia to help him out. And these fabrics were, as much as possible, of course, similarly to what Jeriana was just saying, we can't, you can't go out and buy that now. I mean, my decorator, Cherish Hale, looked for similar things, and we just ended up, my graphic designer, Eddie Afreda, recreated the fabrics. He built those patterns, and we printed all of the fabrics. So it's as accurate as to what was represented in the photographs as we could get. Because again, there was no way to improve on it. I mean, this was brilliant for its time, and what Jeriana did to match the colors. I mean, I remember since we were printing it ourselves, we were looking at a lot of colorways for what exactly that red would be. And that sort of, we landed on a nice cranberry that just so complements so well everything that's going on. I mean, what you can barely see is what all the extras or the background are wearing in this as well. I mean, there was an explosion of pattern. It was thrilling to see it all come together.
Right.
But we really did try to create, and the basic structure of what that showroom is then continues to develop into the more refined white salon, as we called it, when the sort of pearlescent ultra suede furniture comes in, and the sisal and everything bent more towards his minimalism and modernism. But at this point, we just tried our best to just recreate what was documented, because why not? It's so fantastic.
Yeah, and we really leaned into, I think we didn't try to fight this whole pattern on pattern thing. We just kind of dove right in and celebrated it. And truly, even to the background people who are all wearing crazy pattern clothes, we just wanted it to be sort of like, just sort of vibrate on the screen. And, I think at the end of the day, it really did help this tie-dye look so much more sophisticated and really pop.
Have to say, as a historian, it totally warms my heart to know that these textiles were so accurately recreated, and that these primary sources were being used in this way. But I have to say, my absolute favorite moment of the show, of course, had to be the Battle of Versailles. which was, of course, a very pivotal moment in fashion history, which took place on November 28th, 1973. I tell my students that I don't expect them to know many specific dates, but that is one that they need to know. So just a bit of a primer for everyone. The Battle of Versailles was a fundraiser conceived by Eleanor Lambert to raise money for the restoration of the Palace of Versailles. And it was structured as a competition that pitted 5 French designers against 5 American designers, and despite being the underdogs, the Americans emerged victorious. And that is what makes the Battle of Versailles so significant in fashion history. It is the moment that effectively brought global recognition and prestige to American fashion. So, with all of that context, I'll first start by asking Jeriana, how do you even contend with recreating clothes from such a historic event?
Right. I mean, that's what's so wild, is that it is such a historic event. However, the documentation that has survived from it is actually not, it's not all color. It's not all in focus. So it was quite intimidating. And once again, I sort of had to put on my historian hat, my investigator hat, to really gather images from multiple sources. It really was a kind of difficult, from even dresses that he had done on the runway in 1973, kind of right prior to this, that he sort of reinterpreted for Versailles, finding the initial, spark of those ideas, in some documented fashion show moments that led to what became a Versailles moment. To Chris Royer's, personal photographs that she shared of her experience at Versailles, and getting a chance to sort of better, calculate exactly what fabric a dress was made out of. So getting all those details was the first phase of that process. And then really, again, was sort of about dialing into how was I, there were many garments shown at Versailles. It was far more than 6 dresses. And it was really about just dialing it into how are we going to best show a cohesive collection within very few pieces that would also ultimately feel dramatic and, give us that whole Versailles fantasy Philistine. So there are some dresses that were recreations down to the T. For example, the pink, very drop neckline dress all the way to the right there, which was a actual dress worn by Karen Bjornson, I believe, in Versailles, and was recreated. And then there were other things that we took a little bit more artistic license, just to sort of marry again a color palette together. But all of the silhouettes are authentically Halston. And as a matter of fact, the one dress that's sort of in silhouette, more all the way to the left there, that's a caftan. That is a beautiful, and I love that I'm saying this to an FIT audience, so you guys will get it, but it's a beautiful pastel hand-painted silk stripe that has a clear sequin over it. And that is an authentic vintage piece that is, has provenance that came with it, that I know that it came from 1973. And that same fabric and that same material was done as a one-shouldered dress, actually. And that was actually shown in Versailles. And there is documentation of that dress in Versailles. So since it was the same exact fabric, I really had to use it as the sort of inspiration for the entire palette, and then really drove from that the rose golds and aquas and pale pinks and purples that came from that stripe, and created the collection from that.
Fabulous. Well, going off of that, so much of the outcome of the Battle of Versailles came down to the elaborate sets used by the French designers versus the very pared down sets used by the American designers. So Mark, can you tell us how you contended with both the onstage and offstage elements at the Battle of Versailles.
Well, and it's true. And as Jeriana said, there wasn't much photography of the actual show. There were a few that showed the French sides of the sets, and luckily for us, we only had to represent one of them. And again, luckily for us in the set department, the Americans did have just a very stripped down staging where the clothes were just front and center, and it was about the lighting. Because beyond the staging, I mean, what we were trying to do was to just recreate Versailles. I mean, outside of what the actual fashion show was, there had to be Versailles, and we didn't go to Versailles. So the entire backstage wing of the Opera House and the Opera House itself and the stage and the backstage was all cobbled together by, a variety of locations. So I looked a lot at the architecture and the sensibility of what was happening in Versailles. And again, extrapolated from that. I mean, we weren't trying to recreate the king's apartment. I mean, the palace is so vast that the Opera House actually exists on the far corner of one wing. So in my mind's eye, what we were showing in the rest of the palace was the dressing rooms and literally just like the backstage area of this. So it gave us a certain amount of license, but we shot in a mansion up in Yonkers for that portion of it, which was essentially based on the sensibility of Versailles. So we ended up with the right location there. Did a lot of work, brought marble panels to it, and an octagonal a painting in the ceiling that we added. And in Jersey City, we built an entire auditorium that became the Opera House. I mean, a tiered audience. And again, I mean, sort of legendarily, I can never quite get to the bottom of whether the Joe Eula scenery was an actuality. That famously that he was given the dimensions for the staging and recreated some scenery for the Americans, but screwed up the metric versus, the American measuring system. So it was all the wrong size. So on the fly, and we represent this in the show, he just wings a giant painting of the Eiffel Tower. And so that was an element that we had to, bring and to actualize. But it was one of the, I mean, when I think of sort of the 6 main iconic moments in the show, recreating Versailles without going to Versailles was a giant project. So hopefully,
Really, I mean, Mark truly put this together between New Jersey and where, I mean, I can't remember where we were, but it was like 3 different locations that look like one when you see it in the show. So it was really remarkable.
Yeah, we were in Tarrytown, Jersey City, and Yonkers. And there might be something else I'm forgetting, but I think that's it.
Wow, well, you could have fooled me. It really did come together seamlessly. And
Good.
yes, so don't worry about that. We cannot talk about iconic moments depicted on the show without talking about Studio 54. And I have to say the purple look for Liza Minnelli was my absolute favorite from the entire series. But Jeriana, could you tell us more about that costume and perhaps what it was like to outfit all of the denizens of Studio 54?
So recreating that look for Liza was such a special experience, I will say. I worked with Naeem Khan, the fashion designer Naeem Khan, who was a former assistant designer to Halston. He, of course, does his own women's couture evening wear, and his father actually had supplied the beads and was the beader for Halston. He had kept, after working with Halston, many of the beading patterns. So he was able to, when I sort of showed him the piece of research of this jumpsuit and kimono jacket that I wanted to do for Liza for this scene, he had in his back pocket the actual beading patterns for those pieces. So he was able to recreate them for our show to the T. The only thing we manipulated a bit was the color. But truly it is the jumpsuit and kimono jacket that Liza wore. And we really in particular wanted this piece because it just feels like Liza moving when you see this beaded chiffon swing, and as she like does her signature leg work dance moves, it really just has this energy and this kick to it that feels like Liza. We wanted pants because we wanted to, you know, really get as much movement as possible and see her and sort of with this slinky kimono jacket, and it was a labor of love. It was a lot of work to sort of fine tune it and get right to that point where it felt like Krista as Liza, and really, you know, was quite a project, but it was really, I think, wonderful for Krista. She did not want to take it off. And yeah, it had a magic, I think, quality to it, especially with those bugle beads when they hit the light. It just does that sort of Bob Mackie thing where you just kind of can't take your eyes off of it.
So good. I wouldn't want to take it off either. But so recreating Studio 54, I have to ask Mark, which was more of a challenge, recreating that iconic space or recreating Halston's iconic Olympic Tower studio?
You know, they all occupied a certain stress pocket for me. um, you know, like at every given moment, I mean, of course, there was always the focus on whichever one happened to be in front of me on any given day, but because of production, they were all in front of me constantly. And I mean, Olympic Tower was a hugely complicated set to build. I mean, it was from the get-go, just looking at the photographs of it, it was like staring into a kaleidoscope. I mean, it was nearly impossible to figure out what the real shape of the room was just because of all of the reflections in the mirrors. So it wasn't until I actually got on the ground, I went up there to Olympic Tower before I could get up onto the floor, which we eventually gained access to. I just had to look at the footprint of the building to understand really what it was. But just the notion of how to build that for the you know, for the budget that we have, recreating the skyline, the spires. There was again talking to Chris Royer and others to just figure out what the rest of it was. I mean, I knew that there was going to be a vast amount of scripted scenes in the set, so we really wanted to get that one right. Studio 54, it came late in the script process, so that was one that, you know, in the middle of trying to figure out Olympic Tower and everything else, was all right, here comes Studio 54. And we just knew that we had to sort of hit the key moments. We found the right location, which was the Hammerstein Ballroom, and then we proceeded to just recreate it in there. We built the bar, we built the DJ booth, we built the sofas and the lighting and the new moon and the spoon, and we just, you know, and then did the layers of, as Jeriana can tell you, we had how many, 4 distinct parties, or, you know, different scenes. I mean, I mean, specific, Valentino's birthday party, Bianca Jog, you know, birthday party.
And it was our way of sort of experiencing it, I think, more fully and feel it in different theme parties and how they would sort of really transform the space. And I think it helped for our story's sake kind of stretch and contextualize those different times and those different parties.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we had to be quite clever. I mean, that in background included and costumes included when we did all of those parties and all of those moments, you know, because there's an element to what we do practically as designers. You know, we can imagine the moon, but how we actually get there is, you know, can be just a lot of smoke and mirrors. and certainly,
well, I had to build the moon, so
yeah, you actually had to build them.
and then we weren't even allowed smoke and mirror. I mean, there was, you know, to be reminded, we shot all of this during the pandemic, so things that you would rely on, I mean, literally filling the space with smoke, we couldn't do. And I think, even, you know, to add another layer to your brilliance, I mean, just being able to refit people, just recycle and reuse people, and be able to do it with that layer on top of it was, I'm blown away by what Jeriana did on this show, I've got to say. I mean, in doing what we always do, I don't understand how she does in costume and vice versa. It's like could never do, but the level of detail and research and specificity and just her insistence to do this the right way was inspiring to everybody who was working on that show. I mean, it was, you know, I was doing the backgrounds, she was doing she was doing Halston. You know, it was
That's
it
very
was,
kind. It's very kind.
it was really something. She was a joy to work with and collaborate with, and always knew exactly what she was doing in her presentation boards and what the palette was. Because again, of course, we had to collaborate, but generally we did what Halston did, which was to create an environment in which anything could live and was the perfect showpiece. So once I did that, then you know she could run with what she was doing. But we were collaborating in terms of what the period was, what the color
Right.
palette was, what the season was.
And that was all the time, literally, like texting all the time because we
Yeah.
were moving at the speed of light in production, creating it all. And genuinely, as you know, as we're all running and gunning all the time on our feet, you know, approaching something that sometimes we only have days to do or a week to do, it really sometimes was about, you know, letting Mark know I had already committed to with Naeem to do this beaded jumpsuit and this is the color it was going to be.
Mhm.
Or, you know, or vice versa, or this is what the couches are going to be, or the carpet, for example. I mean, the Olympic Tower red is such a signature color of Halston's and was really going to define that space. So we got a cut of your carpet, of the red carpet, and I kept that in my fitting room so that as I was, you know, purchasing pieces or building pieces or selecting reds, you know, for Halston's sport coats or jackets or whatever red would appear in that space, that we could make sure that we found a right balance in that in
Yeah.
those reds. I think
Yeah.
that's an important, you know, part of, you know, painting that entire 16 by 9 canvas that we're given is, you know, is being able to work together and what all of the things that are going to appear in that frame.
Absolutely. And again with speed, I mean, when we were discussing, I mean, do you remember with Studio 54, we would have these meetings and it's like, all right, Valentino, circus, go, you know, just like champagne, you know, just like these parties, these themes
Yeah.
was happening very, very quickly. And it's like, all right, circus.
Well, I think despite the speed of the process, and I've worked in film and television myself, I know how quickly these decisions are made. Um, but despite the speed and despite filming in the middle of a pandemic, it all really does come together into a very holistic experience. And I do think your collaboration does really show. And so I'm very excited for everyone to see the series. But of course, I have to ask you, Jeriana, as a graduate of FIT, I just thought I would ask you about your time as a student and how it has eventually shaped your career.
Well, my time at FIT, I treasure. I should say that. Really, I just can't say that more. Truly, because I think when you are a student, you don't realize how much creative freedom you really have, and really, I advise all FIT students to just soak that in, soak as much of that creating your own voice, you know, pursuing your passions without inhibition. I created a space for myself while I was at FIT as I found myself gravitating towards more theatrical design than fashion design. And I sort of started, you know, this theater ensemble there where we did Rocky Horror. I don't know if they're still doing it now. We did Rocky Horror every year. We did Lysistrata. I mean, you name it. I just picked the plays I wanted to design. and and we had great fun and it really was such an amazing time to really just learn as much as I could and be in such an amazing place that has amazing resource to this beautiful museum and incredible library. And I have to say, when I was doing research for Halston, I went back to the FIT library and used the trove of research that's there, including the videos. I found amazing videos there, that I had to sit and watch on VHS and play back, that had little interviews with Halston that I found nowhere else. So it's really just an incredible school, and I really cherish that experience. And I think it sort of prepared me because I really understood clothes inside and out. I understood construction. I understood the history, and it really was a very well-rounded education in that way. Because all of the professors have a tactile, industry experience, and, are professionals in the industry. Some of those professors that I had, Linda Tain, for example, were incredible, and I'm still very friendly with. So I think it prepared me for this business also, because it taught me tenacity, and I think you need that. I think you need that to do this for a job. I think you really have to want it. And oftentimes I'll tell people, in terms of design as a career, you have to be compelled to do it. You don't necessarily choose to do it. You have to do it. You have to be compelled, and it has to come from within, because it's challenging. It's more challenging than anyone will ever actually let you know. But it's well worth it when it's your art.
And so similarly, Mark, what training prepared you for your illustrious career as a production designer? And do you have perhaps a favorite project you would like to share?
Well, I started as a kid. I mean, not to give my whole bio, but as a kid who wanted to work in movies before I even knew really what that meant. And I grew up in North Carolina and started in the theater. On stage, was just a little kid actor, and then started designing the sets because I had to do that, and it made sense. And then I was lucky enough that movies were coming to town, so I started working on movies then, and got enough experience that then I left the business and went back to NYU and studied. I got my MFA at the scenic design program at NYU. And then just a lot of, on the job training. I mean, you just sort of take the foundation of the skills that you get in programs like that: drafting, painting, rendering, research, all of it, and just apply and just learn, constantly. I mean, there was a period in my life when I was doing 3 jobs at once at different tiers in the program. I mean, I was designing very low budget things and drafting on studio projects, and art directing on medium scale things. And I literally used those 5 years to acknowledge and to just build the skill level, figuring, all right, there will be something to pull from all of this, and then eventually just got there. In terms of a favorite project, I mean, they're all the babies that at the given moment. I mean, I consider myself lucky to I work on things that I really care about, and that really you have to invest in. It's a very hard job, but full of rewards, and you find them daily. So anytime you can get attached to something where there's a story that you feel compelled to be involved with telling, and then when it happens to be something like Halston, where just the sense of what the sets are all combines together, then it's fantastic.
Well, that perfectly leads into my final question for you both, which is whether you have any advice for any students or recent graduates that are interested in pursuing careers in costume or production design.
Well, I would say advice for students seeking this as a career, I would say just get your hands on everything you possibly can. Take every possible opportunity, internships included, volunteer work included, whatever it is, that wherever you can get an in, because what I often tell students is that there really is never going to be a newspaper that you open and circle a job position. It's not that kind of career. So it really is about just starting your network as soon as you possibly can, starting your own legacy as soon as you possibly can, learning everything there is to know. Mark really hit on something about always learning. I think you never stop learning, so that's really important to know. You're never going to be the fully formed version of yourself. So just start. Just don't even waste not one more day, and start. When I was at FIT and I started to really feel this inkling of wanting to do costume, I called a costume house, Parsons Mears, that was in the city, and very, prominent costume house. And I literally just said, I want to do costumes. I go to FIT. We're very close at the time, distance wise. I said, I have this time off from school. I will come and sweep your floors and organize, books or whatever you need me to do. And they let me come in and literally start doing that, sweeping. And then before I knew it, I was pattern making. And then I was, helping swatch for designers that were visiting, and starting, with whatever I could. And that was, through the yellow pages, literally at the time. So just start with what you have, and do what you can, and do it today, because you don't know even if you really want to do something until you're really doing it. So, yeah.
I would agree with all of that. It's just like do everything that you can and meet everybody that you can. The people that you know now in school are going to be the people that you work with, your entire career. I mean, or they're going to lead you to the next people. I created an internship for myself on The Handmaid's Tale, which was the film version that they did, 1,000 years ago. And
With Faye Dunaway as Serena Joy.
With Faye Dunaway and Robert Duvall, and I still work with the people that I worked with on that. I met the people on that show who I have since hired. I mean, my boss has now worked for me. So you never know who you're going to learn from and who you're going to meet, and just create your own experiences. I mean, there's so many more avenues now that I couldn't even name them all. I mean, I feel like, I'm an old war horse who doesn't even understand everything that's happening out there right now, but you just never know. So I think it's just, you've got to love it. It's a demanding job, but in all the best ways, when you are compelled to do it. So there's no, as Jeriana said, exactly, you're never going to like open up the paper. There's never going to be like the silver platter that's offered to you, but you can create those moments yourself, and you never know when they're going to sneak up on you. So just take advantage of it.
Excellent advice. Thank you both. And thank you both for joining me for this conversation. And congratulations to you both on an excellent show. Just as to conclude, Halston is available to stream on Netflix beginning May 14th. So thank you to Jeriana and Mark, and we look forward to your future projects.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So nice to be with FIT students, and thank you for your wonderful questions.